Today, we're going to dive into the delicate balance of our environment and what happens when that balance gets broken.
It sounds like something out of a movie, right? But it's actually closer to reality than you might think. Let's explore how that's even possible.
So, to really get a handle on the problem, we first have to appreciate the system itself, this, beautifully complex machine that is an ecosystem.
We often think of nature in these really simple, straight lines, like a food chain. Energy flows from the grass to the grasshopper that eats it, then to the frog, the snake, and finally the eagle way up at the top. It all seems so neat and tidy.
But here's the thing. In reality, it's way more like a bustling city grid, a super complex food web where everything is connected to everything else. A single plant might be food for a whole bunch of different animals. And those animals, well, they're prey for lots of others. Every single organism has its own special spot and job in this web, which we call its niche.
Okay, so now that we have that picture in our minds, imagine dropping a stone right into this calm, interconnected pond. Just one single disruptive thing that can send ripples absolutely everywhere.
Let's take a look at a real-world example. This is Kolleru Lake, a really vital ecosystem in India that, it's been seriously damaged by human activities.
Okay, now this table is super interesting because it breaks down exactly where the pollution is coming from. You can see how runoff from farms, fish farming, even industrial waste, they all play a part in the lake's decline. They cause these huge chemical problems, like something called eutrophication. Basically, that's when you get too many nutrients, like fertilizers from farms, and it causes this massive explosion of weeds and algae that just chokes out all the other life. All of that, plus other toxins, means a huge loss of plants and animals.
And this problem, it's not just happening at Kolleru Lake. Let's jump to another story. This one's from the Adilabad Water Reservoir, or EBWR, in Telangana. Here, scientists were looking into a really similar issue, and they focused on a species of carp, which is a common food source for the people living there. What they found was pretty serious. The water was contaminated with industrial heavy metals. Iron was the most concentrated, and it went all the way down to cadmium, which was the least. But here's the crucial point. These invisible toxins are now inside the ecosystem, and this is where their dangerous journey up the food chain really begins.
So, how does just a small amount of this stuff become such a huge threat? Well, this is where two really critical ideas come into play.
First up is something called bioaccumulation. This is basically where a toxin, like a heavy metal, builds up inside a single organism. Why? Because its body just can't get rid of the substance faster than it takes it in, so it just keeps collecting over its entire life.
And then there's biomagnification. This is where that concentration gets magnified. It gets amplified as it moves up the food chain from one level to the next.
Seriously, think of it like a pyramid. A tiny bit of poison starts at that huge, wide base with plants and algae. Then, a grasshopper comes along and eats a ton of that contaminated grass, and all that poison gets absorbed into its little body. Next, a frog eats, dozens of those grasshoppers, concentrating the poison even more. By the time you get to the top predator, like an eagle, that one tiny drop of poison has become a super concentrated, often lethal dose. It's a brilliant and frankly terrifying illustration of the danger.
So let's go back to the EBWR for a second, because the researchers found something really alarming. Remember how cadmium was the least concentrated metal in the water? Well, get this. It turned out to be the most accumulated metal in the fish tissues. This is a huge insight. It shows us that some organisms are basically like sponges for specific toxins. They just soak them up at a frightening rate, no matter how little of it is in the environment.
All right, so we've got a polluted lake and we've got contaminated fish. What on earth does this mean for the people living nearby?
Well, this is where that ripple finally hits the shore. Those heavy metals, they don't just stop with the fish. Nope. They're passed directly to the humans who eat them, putting them right at the top of this contaminated food chain. And that poses a really serious risk to their health. Okay, so the situation seems pretty dire, I know. But understanding the problem is always the first step toward finding a solution. So let's take a look at a better approach.
Instead of just throwing more stones into the pond with these non-degradable pesticides, we can actually work with nature. Things like crop rotation or really understanding a pest's life cycle. These are biological principles that let us manage them without poisoning the entire ecosystem. It's just smarter.
And this leaves us with a final really powerful thought. We've seen how one tiny negative action can cause this massive, magnified damage all the way up the food chain. But that same principle of magnification can also work in reverse.
So the question is, what small, positive choices can we make that will ripple outwards and magnify into a healthier world?
All right, team, let's put that knowledge to the test and make sure these super important concepts are locked in. I'm going to throw some questions at you, so feel free to pause on each slide and really think through your answers.
First up, assertion and reason. Take a look at number 1. Is the assertion true? Is the reason true? And, most importantly, does the reason actually explain the assertion? Now, do the same thing for number 2. Think about those unintended side effects of pesticides. Go ahead and pause here if you need a sec.
Okay, now let's apply this to our case study. First question, why are fish such good bioindicators? What makes them a good signal for an ecosystem's health? And for question 2, what is that shocking result about cadmium? Low concentration in the water, high in the fish. What does that tell us about bioaccumulation? Give it some good thought.
Time for a quick recall check, multiple choice. For number 1, what's the term for an organism's specific job and its place in the ecosystem? And for number 2, which of these key processes explains why a poison gets stronger as it moves up from a grasshopper to a hawk?
And finally, let's just summarize the big ideas. Can you clearly explain the difference between a food chain and a food web? What about eutrophication? Can you define it and remember what caused it in our case study? And can you name 2 of those smarter biological alternatives to pesticides? Go on, take a moment to answer these. Look, understanding this incredible web of life and how our actions ripple through it, that's the first step toward protecting it. Thanks so much for joining this explainer.